tariffs, there's been a lot of on and off, some inconsistency.
There's no inconsistency. I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
They promised growth. They talked about jobs. They assured us that America would become stronger. But reality turned out differently.
And police in Italy are investigating possible arson after a fire destroyed more than a dozen Tesla vehicles. Elon Musk is calling the incident at a Rome dealership terrorism. This comes as Tesla has been the target of recent protests around the world.
When the White House imposed 50% tariffs on aluminum, it looked like a decisive step toward economic independence. Politicians applauded, TV channels broadcast the great return of industry. But no one mentioned that it wasn't Chinese factories that were starting to crack at the seams, but American ones.
That's a 10. That's a good one.
On paper, it was a beautiful formula, less dependence on imports, more domestic production, more jobs for Americans. But a few months after the tariffs were introduced, waves of layoffs swept across the country. Factories shut down, production lines were moved abroad, and prices for cars, beer, windows, and even lids skyrocketed.
I think you're going to remember today, it's going to be a free nation that we're dealing with. We're going to have a very free and beautiful nation. It's going to be Liberation Day in America, and it's going to be a day that hopefully you're going to look back in years to come and you're going to say, you know, he was right. This has turned out to be one of the most important days in the history of our country.
Ford Motor Company, one of the greatest legends of the American auto industry, lost more than $4.5 billion on increased raw material costs alone. Production of the F-150, the most popular pickup truck, became almost unprofitable. Parts that used to come from Mexico and Canada are now subject to tariffs. And you know what the company did? It quietly began moving its production facilities to Canada, where supplies are stable and there are no domestic taxes on aluminum. Irony? This is just the beginning.
With Elon Musk's views on weighing into very much national politics, national elections in Europe. And then on top of that, when you see the backdrop of Tesla upgrading its product line and the impact of them trying to chase more sales at the back end of last year, that means it's short on inventory. It can't necessarily sell as many vehicles or doesn't have as many in stock to sell. So there is that issue there of a confluence of impacts, which means that sales have been falling. Again, the question is how much more that will impact into February as well, given that the back end of last year, in 2024, Tesla sales did slip overall.
A factory worker in Kentucky admitted, "I used to change my car every 5 years. Now I can't even afford an old Fiesta. When an American can't buy an American car, it's no longer economics. It's a diagnosis."
US President Donald Trump has announced a 25% tariff on all car and light truck imports into the country. It's due to come into effect on April 2nd. Economists and world leaders are warning that it will be a tax on consumers and have a chilling effect on the global economy. But to Americans, Trump paints a rosy picture, predicting that the levies will spur growth.
And while Washington was talking about victory in the trade war, ordinary families were counting every penny, putting off replacing their refrigerators or buying new windows, because the tariffs didn't hit China. They hit Georgia, Ohio, Michigan, and Texas. They hit those who work, not those who make headlines.
Ready? The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come into the United States and build a factory in the United States so it doesn't have to pay the tariff.
That will take many, as you know, that will take many years.
In fact, I'll tell you, there's another theory is that the tariff, you make it so high, so horrible, so obnoxious that they'll come right away. When I do the 10%, 10% is really, first of all, 10% when you collect it is hundreds of billions of dollars. The numbers that you're talking, all reducing our deficit. But really, so there's two ways of looking at a tariff. You can do it as a money-making instrument, or you can do it as something to get the companies. Now, if you want the companies to come in.
And Canada, it didn't respond with noise. It didn't hold rallies, it just opened new factories. It attracted investors. It created jobs. Quietly, Ford and dozens of other American companies began assembling products in their northern neighbor, there where the economy is driven not by slogans but by calculations. And now the big question, are we protecting America? Or are we strangling it with our own hands? Why has patriotism come to cost us 10 cents for a can of Coca-Cola and $4,000 for every new car? Who benefits from this policy, other than the statistics in political speeches?
After weeks of whiplash, Trump threatening tariffs, imposing some and walking back others, many Americans are feeling the uncertainty. In Swisher, Iowa, distillery owner Jeff Quint says it's paralyzing.
The bourbon industry is going to be collateral damage in this tariff war. I don't really think there's any way around that.
And he's not alone. Tonight, the majority of Americans, 61%, now say they disapprove of how the president is handling tariffs. 56% say they disapprove of his handling of the economy overall. But the president has dismissed those concerns tonight, saying he has the right to change course.
This video is not about attacks or slogans. It is a story about how one decision made with grandstanding can change the fate of millions when numbers and facts speak louder than microphones. Are you ready to learn what is really going on behind the scenes of the tariff war? Then listen carefully.
After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
When in the early 2020s, the US president introduced 50% tariffs on aluminum imports, it was presented as a life-saving measure, a step toward economic independence, industrial revival, and job creation.
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States. Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe.
The talk was of protecting domestic producers, fighting cheap imports, and regaining control over raw material supply chains. Politicians called it America's economic shield. However, after just a couple of years, it became clear that this shield was too heavy and too sharp. It hurt those it was supposed to protect. Companies like Ford were particularly hard hit, and with them, entire cities, regions, and ordinary families across the country. Formerly, everything looked logical. America imported more than 5 million tons of aluminum per year, of which almost 60% was supplied by Canada. Washington decided that such volumes made the country vulnerable, especially in an unstable international environment. But the reality turned out to be much more complicated. Aluminum production is an extremely energy-intensive process, and it was impossible to build a complete infrastructure in the US from scratch in a short period of time. The companies that remained from the previous century simply could not cope with the growth in demand and internal competition. This led to shortages, price hikes, and panic in industrial sectors. Immediately after the tariffs were introduced, the price of aluminum in the US jumped from $1,700 to $2,500 per ton. This hit everyone, from the auto and aircraft industries to soda can manufacturers. The auto industry was particularly hard hit because manufacturers do not produce aluminum, they buy it. Ford, GM, and Boeing were all in the same boat. According to internal estimates by the UAW union, Ford's additional raw material costs rose to $2.1 billion per year, and each F-150 pickup truck, which symbolized the American working class, became $3,200 more expensive solely because of its aluminum body. In terms of total sales, This meant a loss of approximately $450 million in net profit per year, money that could have gone toward new jobs, research and development, or plant upgrades. Officials in Washington responded with rehearsed phrases, "These are temporary difficulties for the greater good." But while these difficulties persisted, Ford had to close 2 lines in Ohio, lay off 1,400 employees in Kentucky, and suspend investments in electric transportation in Illinois. One engineer, 26-year-old Thomas Wiley, shared in an interview, "I was laid off 3 weeks after my son was born. I didn't understand why. The plant was running steadily. And then the layoff started because of aluminum. Who could have thought that politics could take away my job and my child's future?" Against the backdrop of this crisis in the US, the situation in Canada looked surprisingly stable. No internal taxes on aluminum, no rush, no hysteria. The Canadian government did not go down the path of symmetrical tariffs, but instead offered a package of subsidies for businesses affected by the loss of American customers. As a result, many American companies simply began to move part of their production north. Ford opened 2 new support lines in Ontario, and GM moved part of its transmission assembly to Quebec. These moves were not publicized, but local Canadian media reported a sharp increase in industrial employment since the end of 2022. Analysts called it a quiet migration of manufacturing. Within the US itself, anxiety was growing. A Brookings Institution study found that more than 45,000 manufacturing jobs had been lost due to tariffs, with the majority in states that traditionally vote for a protectionist agenda: Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Michigan. Production chains that had been built up over decades of free trade began to collapse. In desperation, some small businesses even returned to using steel instead of aluminum, despite the technological environmental costs. One trailer manufacturer in Oklahoma said, "We switched to steel just to survive, but now we need more fuel for delivery. We have higher tire wear, and the vehicles are heavier. That means higher costs." Experts proposed alternative measures, subsidizing secondary aluminum recycling, investing in environmentally friendly aluminum smelters, and entering into long-term contracts with allies. But these proposals were drowned out by the noise of political campaigns. Instead of a comprehensive economic strategy, the country got a tariff club that, instead of hitting its competitors, hit his own fingers. This was felt most acutely at the household level. According to the National Association of Consumers, the average cost of new cars in 2024 rose by 19% compared to 2020. The average interest rate on car loans rose to 7.9% per annum. For the first time in 15 years, demand for used cars over 10 years old exceeded demand for new ones. People started saving on everything from maintenance to tire replacement. Workers in Detroit and Tulsa said they now carpool to work in groups of 4 to share gas and wear and tear costs. And all this for a temporary sacrifice for the sake of the country? But the country is these people. They are the ones who are losing their jobs, cutting back on food, giving up insurance, and selling their children's toys to pay for a new battery. And yet, not so long ago, they believed that America was returning to the golden age of industrialization. That slogans like "Make America Great Again" would not cause their cars to become a luxury and beer a holiday treat. Canada, meanwhile, has become the epitome of strategic restraint. Instead of slogans, there is calculation. Instead of flashes in the pan, there are systematic steps. Even in economic schools, this case has begun to be discussed as an example of how soft economic policy can outplay brute force. According to an internal report by the Harvard Business Review, Canadian manufacturing sectors have become 14% more attractive to investors than their American counterparts, precisely because of their predictability and flexibility. And this is where the main question arises: if the goal is to protect American businesses and jobs, why are they the ones in the line of fire? Why are millions of Americans now living in survival mode? Why is the consumer paying 30 cents more for an aluminum can, and the automaker losing millions, all because of an attempt to be tougher? There is still no answer, but the numbers speak for themselves. In the shadow of the tariff storm that has engulfed American industry, the name Ford has become a symbol not just of corporate defeat, but of national confusion. This is not just a story about rising aluminum prices, it is a profound, almost tragic metaphor for how patriotic decisions dictated from the podium can turn into a chain of victims, from a factory engineer in Ohio to a shopper in Texas trying to make ends meet. Ford, as the largest player in the domestic market, found itself at the center of this storm, and it is through its example that the full scale of the consequences can be seen. While some were throwing around slogans, the company was losing ground not because of weakness, but because of political conditions created without taking into account the realities of modern manufacturing. Internal company reports leaked to the press in the spring of 2024 showed that Ford was facing not just rising costs, but a systemic crisis. Spending on raw materials, logistics, and staff retraining rose by 37% in just a year and a half. At the same time, demand fell as people refused to buy new cars, especially in the truck segment. The F-150, which had recently been the sales leader, was now out of reach for the average consumer. In the Rust Belt, where this model had once been a symbol of masculinity and stability, car dealerships began to close. According to estimates by the Automobile Dealers Association, 238 Ford dealerships closed in 5 states in 2023 alone. More than 9,000 people lost their jobs. The company tried to maneuver. Temporary discounts were launched. Promotions to buy back old models were introduced, and markups were reduced. But it was all like playing with a broken calculator. Inside the company, engineers suggested lightweight versions of cars with plastic hoods and cheaper alloys, but consumers saw them as cheap knockoffs of the originals. Trust was falling. In March 2024, one of Ford's vice presidents, speaking on condition of anonymity, admitted to Politico, "We didn't lose the battle with China or Mexico. We lost it to ourselves, to our own rules." This internal voice seemed to echo the entire American industry, which had been forced to fight blindly. Meanwhile, things looked different in Canada. Ontario, where Ford launched 2 new production facilities for electric vehicles and auxiliary components in 2023, became a new industrial center, unexpectedly overtaking Detroit in terms of productivity. Where there were strikes and layoffs in the US, there was expansion and hiring in Canada. Salaries were slightly lower, of course, but conditions were more stable and support from provincial authorities was more tangible. Canada did not just survive the trade war, it turned it into an opportunity. Instead of symmetrical tariffs, the government offered a system of subsidies, tax breaks, and accelerated certification for companies moving production from south to north. But the irony was that it was American companies, not Chinese or German, that began moving to Canada en masse. General Parts Company, Whirlpool, Electrotech, and dozens of other players quietly launched new assembly lines in Montreal, Vancouver, and even in small towns like London, Ontario, where there had previously been almost no economic activity. The Canadian Ministry of Industry recorded a 22% increase in industrial imports in 23 and an 18% increase in exports of finished products. These figures seemed like dry statistics, but behind them were the fates of Canadian workers, American customers, and lost opportunities for the US. Financial Times journalists called it silent capital migration. Unlike Trump's America First approach, Canada made no proclamations. It simply waited, opening its doors, simplifying procedures, and watching as its competitors brought their resources to it. American manufacturers, from kitchen appliances to electric generators, explained their move to Canada by saying that there they could build a long-term strategy. This was particularly evident in June 2024, when Titan Tools, the largest contract assembly company, moved its entire lawn mower assembly cycle from Iowa to Quebec, saving $72 million on aluminum and logistics in the first year. The US public began to feel cheated. Workers who had voted for tough tariffs began to realize that they had lost. "We wanted to punish China, but we punished Detroit," wrote one commenter under an article in the Washington Post. The idea began to take hold in the national consciousness. Being a patriot does not mean suffering senseless losses. Politicians continued to insist on economic independence, but more and more people were asking, what kind of independence is it, if even our brands are fleeing abroad? All this happened quietly. There were no rallies, no protests. Ford did not hold press conferences or directly accuse the government. But actions spoke louder than words. In its fourth quarter 2024 report, Ford's CEO indicated that the share of production outside the US had increased by 23%. This meant only one thing: the company no longer believed that it could operate profitably here in its homeland, and many others no longer believed it either. While the US was discussing how to restore its industry, Canada was simply taking action. They did not promise to make industry great, but it became so. They did not say we will punish everyone, but created conditions so that no one would want to leave. And in this simple silence, in these calculations and sober steps, true strength was revealed, not in iron speeches, but in the fact that iron, aluminum, and workers' hands remained in place and did their job